Could humans, imperfect in their very nature, ever create a perfect machine? Could that machine be moral in a platonic sense? Like, could it operate outside of the political and moral biases of its creators? Well, in They'd Rather Be Right by Mark Clifton and Frank Riley, widely considered to be the worst novel ever to be awarded a Hugo, they are some of the questions that we're aiming to understand, so let's get into it. First published as a 4-part serial in astounding science fiction from August 1954 to November 1954, They'd Rather Be Right, later abridged and published in novel form by Galaxy Publishing. Well, sort of. Like many science fiction stories from this era, the publishing history of They'd Rather Be Right is complicated and confusing and contains many different texts and formats and different titles, some of which contain some prequel short stories from Mark Clifton and some don't. So let's just say it was published in Astounding and then it was a novel. So what's it about? Well, the story focuses on 4 main characters. We've got Professor Billings and Hoskins, who are both two kind of genius professors who are working on a cybernetic brain called Bossy. We've got Joe, who is a telepath. You'll remember from my last video, if you saw it, that also features a telepath. Telepaths clearly was something that the science fiction writers of the 50s thought was going to happen and unfortunately never did. But we have a telepath, a young student named Joe, who's sort of manipulating the whole thing. He's like the really clever one. He's the mastermind behind the whole thing, really. He can manipulate people's emotions and things like that. And then the 4th character is sort of Bossy itself, which becomes more and more of a character depending on how you look at it as the novel progresses. The central conceit of the novel is that Bossy is this sort of transcendent being who operates outside of human prejudice, who can make decisions that are purely logical and rational, and that essentially this machine is always right. It's funny, isn't it? Like, here's a novel written in the early 50s, and these ideas of sort of opinion control and partisan politics, they seem to be particularly relevant. Like, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm getting older, but, you know, we certainly, from my perspective, seem to be living in a very divisive time, and probably the most divisive time that I can remember, where everyone's opinion is called into question, right? Everyone's opinion is assumed to be some kind of derivative of their political beliefs or the sort of hard and fast ideology. We know it's never really considered that someone's opinion, especially if it deviates from the common one, it's never considered that it might be logical or rational or anything like that. And so you can see the appeal of deferring to an authority that is always right, that can't be wrong. Of course, in reality, often that takes the form of a god of some description, but in this, it takes the form of Bossy. But being innately right isn't Bossy's only ability. Using a combination of plasma, cables, and conversation, Bossy can rid people of their pesky prejudices and give them eternal youth. How does this work exactly? From the machine, in due course, a man or woman would emerge, a real man or woman, not the twisted, warped, pitiful deformity which passes for human. The science here is a little thin. The idea is something like, because stress and anxiety accelerate aging, which is true, then if we could get rid of stress and anxiety and all of those sort of worldly troubles, then we wouldn't age anymore. Which is, at the very least, a little misguided because, well, it assumes that there aren't other factors that contribute to aging. But in fairness, to Mark Clifton, cellular biology was then and is now a kind of emerging and growing field. We were learning more and more about it all the time, and specifically in the 50s, it was a very young science. But also maybe I'm misrepresenting what's going on here. So if it's more complicated than that, if I've missed something, then feel free to let me know in the comments. The novel plays out as a kind of race against time between the central characters who are trying to complete Bossy and gather evidence of what it can do. And then these central intelligence agencies that are trying to track them down and put a stop to everything because they're scared of what will happen if the knowledge of Bossy gets out to the public. Eventually, though, what happens is that Bossy is rendered sort of ineffectual because in order to drink from its fountain of youth, in order to be granted eternal life and to always be right, you have to first admit that you're wrong, that you're flawed, that your ideas, even the ones you're most convinced about, are all wrong, and people would rather be right. So why all the controversy then? Like, why is They'd Rather Be Right or The Forever Machine a kind of much maligned novel? Reviewing a 1982 reprint of the novel, David Langford, himself a multiple-time Hugo winner, said this: "Though it contains an interesting idea, the book seems an implausible award winner. It's fine to postulate a machine giving immortality, youth, and perfect complexion to those and only those who can cast aside preconceptions and prejudices. The idea, though, is flattened into the ground by the author's reluctance to do the work which would make it convincing." And then in an almost identical review in The Guardian almost 30 years later, the deeper problem is that the authors do not do the work to show why their idea might work even within the internal logic of the book. There are also some, call them theories, call them conspiracies, call them speculation, call them whatever you want, but there are some ideas that one of the reasons They'd Rather Be Right could have won the Hugo that year is because of its ties to Scientology. Certainly just a cursory reading of the book, there are some similar ideas there. There's these ideas of kind of leaving your sort of earthly attachments, rants about the problems with psychiatry. These are definitely present in the book and are clear links to Scientology. And Scientology was also published in Astounding just a few years before Dianetics was published in Astounding. So, there are links to be made. There's no hard evidence, though, that these things are related. Whatever the reason, having now read it, do I think it deserves the criticism that it gets? Yes and no. It's definitely not a great novel. It might not even be a good novel. But it's entertaining enough. And there are some ideas in here, even if they're not fully explored, that, give you space, allow you to ponder and consider and think about. They're interesting ideas, things like our prejudices and what education means, bias, things like this. Politically controlled opinion. Yeah, maybe they're thin, but it's there, and it got my brain going a bit. I'd say the thing is, though, the reason I read a lot of these older science fiction stories and what I love about them, whether there's a sort of good yarn hidden in there or not, is that they provide kind of windows into the kind of public opinion or public consciousness of like what people thought about these scientific advances of the time. So an interesting thing here is the stuff with cellular biology and this idea that reducing stress can reduce aging, and it's like you can see where those leaps were made. You can see why they might have thought that could have been the case, even if the work wasn't done like some of the criticism says. So these things are all still present. It's still enjoyable on that level, but no, it's not great, and it's definitely not as good as The Demolished Man, which is the first Hugo that was won. But I would say you go read it yourself, and you let me know what you think. And then join me tomorrow, where I will be discussing, for Tiptree Tuesday, I'll be discussing James Tiptree Jr.'s 1971 short story, The Peacefulness of Vivyan. I'll see you then.